A bleeding kid named Finn brought a story of injustice with him, forcing the old mountain man to make a choice: help or ignore. That choice turned his quiet canyon into a battlefield between a fugitive clinging desperately to a lie and a sheriff obsessed with revenge. Jebediah was caught in the middle, and he soon learned that bullets aren't the deadliest thing that can kill you in these mountains. Sometimes it's the truth. Hello everyone and welcome. It's great to have you with us today. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Jebediah's world was carved from rock and silence. For more years than he cared to count, his only companions had been the hawks circling high above Shadow Canyon and the steady wind that whispered through the pines. His cabin, a sturdy structure of timber and mud, was nestled so deep within the canyon walls that it seemed less built and more grown from the earth itself. His face was a roadmap of that life, with lines etched by sun and hardship, and his eyes held the patient, watchful quality of a predator. He was a man who belonged to the mountains, and they, in turn, belonged to him. His days followed a simple, unchanging rhythm. He rose with the sun, his movements economical and sure as he checked the trap lines that snaked through the surrounding wilderness. He knew the land intimately, reading the stories left in the dirt, the hurried tracks of a rabbit, the deep print of a bear, the subtle indentation of a snake slithering over stone. This was his language, the only one he needed. Once every season, when his supply of salt and coffee ran low, Jebediah would make the 2-day trek to the dusty settlement of Lone Oak. He'd load his mule with a carefully bundled stack of prime beaver and fox pelts, his face set in a stoic mask that discouraged conversation. In town he was a ghost, a silent figure who traded his wares, bought his necessities, and vanished back into the wilderness before the saloon had even poured its first morning whiskey. He never lingered. The low murmur of voices, the sharp laughter, the very presence of other people felt like an intrusion, a grating noise that disrupted the profound quiet he had cultivated for himself. He had come to these mountains to forget the world of men, to erase a past stained with loss that had hollowed him out years ago. Here, there was only the clean, brutal honesty of survival. The mountains didn't lie, they didn't betray, and they didn't ask questions. They simply were. This morning, however, something was different. As Jebediah moved along a ridge overlooking a dry creek bed, his eyes caught a disturbance in the familiar pattern of tracks. He crouched low, his calloused fingers hovering over the marks in the dust. These weren't the tracks of any animal he knew. They were made by boots, worn down at the heel, and they were chaotic, stumbling, and desperate. The man who made them had been running and running hard. He'd crashed through brush instead of going around it, slipped on loose rock, and dragged one foot more than the other. It was the frantic signature of a man being hunted. For the first time in a decade, the world of men had breached the silent walls of his canyon, and Jebediah felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Trouble had found its way into his sanctuary. Following the tracks downhill, Jebediah moved with a silence that was almost supernatural. He slipped between boulders and through thorny brush without a sound, his rifle held loosely in one hand. The trail led him to the parched bed of what was once a flowing creek, and there, slumped against a large, sun-bleached boulder, was the source of the disturbance. It was a young man, hardly more than a boy, with a mop of dark, sweat-matted hair and a face pale with pain and exhaustion. His shirt was torn and stained with a dark, ugly patch of dried blood high on his shoulder. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Jebediah watched him from a distance for a long moment, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, to let this piece of the outside world resolve itself without his involvement. But then the young man's eyes fluttered open, and in them, Jebediah saw a flicker of raw animal terror that resonated with a dark memory buried deep inside him. Slowly, deliberately, Jebediah broke cover and approached. The young man flinched, trying to push himself up, his hand weakly reaching for the empty holster at his belt. "Easy now," Jebediah's voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse. "You're in no shape to be running." The stranger, whose name he would soon learn was Finn, slumped back against the rock. He's coming for me," he rasped, his voice cracking. "Who's coming?" Jebediah asked, his eyes scanning the surrounding ridges. Finn took a shaky breath and began to speak, his story tumbling out in a broken, desperate torrent. He claimed he'd been guiding a party of silver prospectors. Their employer, a ruthless town sheriff named Craven, had waited until they'd found a rich vein, then turned on them, intending to keep the map and the silver for himself. Finn swore he was the only one who had escaped the slaughter. "He killed them all," Finn whispered, his eyes wide with horror. Shot them down like dogs. I've got the map. It's the only reason I'm still breathing. Jebediah listened, his expression unreadable. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude, told him this was a lie. It was too neat, too dramatic, but the desperation in Finn's eyes, that bone-deep fear, felt genuine. It was a look he remembered seeing in the mirror a lifetime ago. Against his better judgment, a flicker of something long dormant, pity perhaps, or a ghost of his former self, stirred within him. He made a decision. With a grunt, he slung his rifle over his shoulder, bent down, and hauled the injured man to his feet. "Can you walk?" he asked. Finn could barely stand. Without another word, Jebediah hoisted him over his shoulder in a fireman's carry and began the arduous climb back to his hidden cabin. He treated the wound with a poultice of herbs and bandaged it with clean strips of cloth. For 2 days, Finn drifted in and out of a fevered sleep, muttering fragments of his story. Jebediah sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, listening. He tried to piece the words together, to read the truth in the fevered ramblings, just as he read the tracks in the dust, but the story remained murky, its edges blurred by pain and fear. While Jebediah was tending to his unwelcome guest, a dust-caked rider on a powerful black horse entered the town of Lone Oak. This was Sheriff Craven, and he did not look like a man who had just committed mass murder. He was tall and lean, with a face that seemed carved from granite and cold, unwavering grey eyes. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of absolute confidence and purpose. He didn't head for the saloon to quench his thirst, but went straight to the general store, his spurs ringing softly on the wooden boardwalk. The proprietor, a man who had known Jebediah for years as a silent customer, watched nervously as the lawman approached. Craven didn't raise his voice or make threats. He spoke in a low, even tone that carried more weight than any shout. He was looking for a fugitive, a man named Finn. He described him perfectly, right down to the scar above his left eyebrow. "He's a killer," Craven stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Tricked my younger brother Thomas into a partnership to find a silver claim. Once they found it, Finn murdered him to keep it all for himself." The store owner shifted uncomfortably. He remembered seeing Jebediah in town just a few days prior, stocking up on more supplies than usual. He was a man who valued his privacy, a man you didn't cross. But the sheriff's gaze was heavy, expectant. Reluctantly, the proprietor mentioned the mountain man, describing the direction he always took back into the canyons. "He keeps to himself," the man added quickly, "not the kind to get involved in trouble." "Trouble has a way of finding anyone who offers shelter to a man like Finn," Craven replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. He paid for a few supplies, his movements precise and methodical. He then went to the saloon, not to drink, but to hire 3 hard-looking men, promising them a handsome reward for the capture of his brother's killer. He wasn't building a posse of righteous citizens. He was assembling a hunting party. He understood that Shadow Canyon was a different kind of territory, one where a badge meant less than a steady hand and a keen eye. To hunt in a mountain man's domain, you needed wolves, not sheep. As the sun began to set, casting long, dark fingers across the landscape, Sheriff Craven and his newly formed party rode out of Lone Oak, their faces grim and determined. They were heading for Shadow Canyon, bringing the very conflict Jebediah had spent a lifetime avoiding directly to his doorstep. A week passed. Finn's fever broke, and the color began to return to his face. Under Jebediah's care, the wound on his shoulder started to heal, though it would leave a nasty scar. As his strength returned, so did his confidence. He started moving around the small cabin, examining Jebediah's few possessions with a restless curiosity. Jebediah watched him, his silence a heavy blanket in the small space. He noticed things. Finn's hands, for instance, were not the calloused, work-worn hands of a simple guide. They were quick and nimble. One afternoon, while gutting a fish for their meal, Jebediah saw how Finn handled a skinning knife, with a practiced, deadly efficiency that was unsettling. He also saw the way Finn's eyes would occasionally dart towards the worn Colt peacemaker that Jebediah kept on a high shelf, a flicker of longing in his gaze. These were small details, but in Jebediah's world, small details were the ones that kept you alive. His own supplies were running low again, particularly salt for curing meat. It was a risk, but a necessary one. Leaving Finn with a stern warning to stay inside and show no sign of life, Jebediah made the journey back to Lone Oak. The town felt different this time. There was a tension in the air, a low hum of anticipation. In the general store, he overheard 2 men talking in hushed tones about Sheriff Craven and his hunt for his brother's killer. They spoke of the sheriff's cold determination, his single-minded pursuit of justice. The story they told was a far cry from the one Finn had gasped out by the creek bed. According to the town's version, Finn was the villain, a backstabbing thief who had murdered his partner in cold blood. The most chilling detail was how the sheriff's brother, Thomas, had been found, with a knife wound in his back. Jebediah paid for his salt and bullets, his face an impassive mask, but inside his mind was racing, a knife in the back. He thought of Finn's unnerving skill with a blade. He thought of the inconsistencies in his story, the details that never quite lined up. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that was far uglier and more dangerous than he had imagined. He loaded his mule and left town without another word, the whispers of Lone Oak echoing in his ears. As he journeyed back to the canyon, the familiar silence of the mountains no longer felt peaceful. It felt ominous, heavy with the weight of a lie. He had let a fox into his henhouse, and now the hunter was closing in. His trust, a commodity he hadn't offered anyone in 20 years, had been betrayed. Jebediah returned to the cabin just as dusk was settling, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and purple. Finn was sitting by the fire, humming a tune, looking almost relaxed. The sight of it sent a flare of cold anger through Jebediah. He dropped the sack of supplies onto the dirt floor with a heavy thud that made Finn jump. The younger man looked up, his easy smile faltering as he saw the hard, unforgiving look in Jebediah's eyes. The mountain man didn't waste time with pleasantries. He stood over Finn, his large frame casting a long shadow in the flickering firelight. "I was in Lone Oak," Jebediah said, his voice low and dangerous. "They're telling a different story down there, a story about a sheriff's younger brother." Finn's face went pale. He scrambled to his feet, his composure shattering like glass. "They're lies. Craven is twisting things, trying to make me look like the killer." "The story I heard mentioned a knife," Jebediah continued, his voice relentless. "In the back. Seems like a strange way for a man to defend himself." Finn stared at him, his eyes wide and cornered. The pretense of the innocent victim fell away, replaced by the raw desperation of a trapped animal. He started pacing the small cabin, running his hands through his hair. "It wasn't like that," he said, his voice rising. "All right, it wasn't exactly like I said. Thomas, he and I had an argument. Over the map. He pulled a knife on me first, I swear it. We fought. It was crazy. I didn't mean for him to die, but it happened. It was self-defense." He pleaded with his eyes, trying to sell this new revised version of the truth. "You have to believe me, Jebediah. You live out here, away from their laws. You know what it's like. It was him or me." Jebediah listened, his stony expression never changing. He knew now, with absolute certainty, that he was being played. Finn was a chameleon, changing his story to fit the circumstances, using whatever scraps of truth he could find to weave a more believable lie. But the damage was done. By helping Finn, by giving him shelter, Jebediah had tied his own fate to the young man's. Sheriff Craven wouldn't see a distinction between the killer and the man who harbored him. In the eyes of the law, they were now partners. "It doesn't matter what I believe anymore," Jebediah said, his voice heavy with resignation. "He's coming for both of us now." The fire crackled in the sudden silence, the only sound in a room now thick with distrust and the shared certainty of approaching violence. 3 days later they came. Jebediah spotted them first, 4 riders picking their way carefully up the canyon floor. He recognized one as Sheriff Craven, his posture ramrod straight even in the saddle. They moved like hunters, spreading out, using the terrain for cover. They knew what they were doing. Jebediah ducked back from his lookout spot and moved quickly to the cabin. "They're here," he said, the 2 words landing like stones in the quiet room. Finn's face, which had been regaining some of its healthy color, turned ashen. He ran to the small window, peeking through a crack in the shutter. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Jebediah didn't answer. He was already in motion, grabbing his rifle, checking the load. He was no longer the reluctant host. He was the master of this domain, and it was under attack. Craven and his men didn't launch a frontal assault. The sheriff was too smart for that. He knew a direct attack on a mountain man's cabin in a narrow canyon was suicide. Instead, he initiated a siege. He sent 2 of his men to circle around and position themselves on the ridge above, cutting off any chance of escape to higher ground. He and the other man took up positions behind a rock slide 100 yards from the cabin, effectively bottling them in. The first shot wasn't aimed at the cabin. It was a single deliberate rifle crack that splintered the wooden support of the small awning over Jebediah's porch. a clear and chilling message. Then, Craven's voice echoed through the canyon, amplified by the rock walls. "Jebediah, my fight is not with you. I know you're in there. Send out Finn, the man who murdered my brother, and you can walk away from this. I give you my word." Finn flattened himself against the floor. "He's lying. He'll kill us both." Jebediah ignored him. He peered through a small peephole he had drilled into the log wall years ago. He could see Craven, partially hidden behind a boulder. He was patient. He wasn't going to rush. He was going to starve them out or wait for them to make a mistake. The sun beat down on the canyon, and the day grew hot and still. The silence between the echoes of Craven's calls was more nerve-wracking than any gunfight. Inside the cabin, the air grew thick with tension. Finn was a bundle of raw nerves, pacing like a caged wolf, while Jebediah remained unnaturally calm, his mind working, processing, studying the familiar lines of his canyon, searching for a way out of a trap that was closing in with every passing minute. The siege dragged on for 2 days. The heat inside the cabin became unbearable during the day, and the nights were filled with a tense, watchful silence. Their water supply, stored in a barrel in the corner, was dwindling fast. The pressure was taking its toll, especially on Finn. He had gone from panicked to sullen, and now he was growing angry, blaming Jebediah for their predicament. "We should have run for it when we had the chance," he spat, glaring at the old man who was methodically cleaning his rifle. "We could have been miles away by now, but you just had to sit here and wait for them." Jebediah finished wiping down the rifle barrel and looked at Finn, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "There was never a chance to run," he said, his voice flat. "They would have tracked us down in open country inside a day. This is the only place we have an advantage." "Some advantage," Finn scoffed, gesturing wildly at the walls around them. "We're trapped in a box, waiting to die of thirst." His fear had finally boiled over into a reckless rage. "This is your fault. If you had just given me a horse and some food." That was the breaking point for Jebediah. He rose to his full height, his quiet demeanor replaced by a sudden, intimidating intensity. He grabbed Finn by the front of his shirt and slammed him against the log wall. The impact knocked the wind out of the younger man. "My fault?" Jebediah's voice was a low growl, laced with all the fury he had kept bottled up. "You brought this plague to my door. You came here with a lie on your lips, and now you want to blame me? I want the truth, not the half-story you told me by the fire. All of it, now." Staring into Jebediah's unblinking, furious eyes, Finn finally broke. The bravado, the anger, the lies, it all crumbled away, leaving only a pathetic, shivering core of fear. Tears streamed down his face as the confession spilled out of him, ugly and unfiltered. He admitted everything. There was no argument with Thomas Craven. There was no self-defense. He had befriended the sheriff's trusting younger brother with the sole intention of stealing the map to the silver claim. He had waited for the right moment when Thomas's back was turned, and he had buried his knife in it without a moment's hesitation. He was a coward and a killer, driven by nothing more than pure, simple greed. Jebediah shoved him away in disgust. Finn slid down the wall to the floor, sobbing. The confession hung in the air, more suffocating than the heat. For Jebediah, the truth was a physical blow. He had taken this man in, tended his wounds, and defended him. He had seen a reflection of his own past pain in this boy's eyes, but it had all been a lie. He hadn't been sheltering a victim, he had been protecting a monster, a creature who embodied the very cruelty and betrayal that had driven him into the wilderness in the first place. He realized with a sickening certainty that by trying to do a good deed, he had made himself an accomplice to evil. The weight of Finn's confession settled over Jebediah, heavy and suffocating. He stared at the pathetic, weeping figure on the floor and felt a profound sense of revulsion. His first instinct was primal and simple, to throw the cabin door open and toss Finn out into the sunlight, to let Craven have his justice, or his revenge. It would be easy, it would be clean. He could wash his hands of this whole sordid affair and return to his solitude. He walked to the door, his hand resting on the heavy wooden bar that locked it. He could hear Craven's men shifting their positions outside. One move, and it would all be over. But he hesitated. He looked back at Finn. The weeping had subsided into ragged, hitching breaths. In that moment, stripped of all his lies and bravado, Finn looked impossibly young and terrified. Jebediah didn't see a monster anymore. He saw a frightened boy who had made a terrible, irredeemable mistake and was now about to pay for it with his life. And what about Craven? Was the sheriff truly seeking justice, or was this a personal vendetta? Would he simply kill Finn, or would he make him suffer? And what would happen to Jebediah, the man who had harbored him? The lawman's promise of letting him walk away now seemed as hollow as Finn's own stories. A man like Craven didn't leave loose ends. Jebediah stepped away from the door. He was a man who had lived by a simple code, one dictated by the harsh realities of the mountains. But this was different. This was not about survival. It was about principle. He would not be an executioner. He would not hand a man over to be slaughtered, not even a man as despicable as Finn. He had made a mistake in trusting him, but he would not make another by surrendering his own humanity. He would not allow a killing to happen on his land. But he also would not allow a murderer to walk free. A new plan began to form in his mind, one that was risky and uncertain. He would use his greatest asset, his unparalleled knowledge of the canyon, to end this siege, but on his own terms. He would not be a pawn for Craven or a protector for Finn. He would become the canyon's arbiter, and let the rocks and ridges deliver their own kind of justice. As the moon rose, casting a pale, ghostly light over the canyon, Jebediah made his move. He pried loose a section of the cabin's floorboards, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel he had dug years ago as an emergency exit. It was a tight squeeze, leading out to a crevice hidden behind a thicket of manzanita bushes 100 feet from the cabin. "Get in," he ordered Finn, who looked at the dark hole with terror. "It's this or you wait for the sheriff." Fear of Craven won out. Finn scrambled into the tunnel, and Jebediah followed, pulling a rock over the exit to hide their escape. They emerged into the cool night air, the sounds of the siege now behind them. But they weren't running away. Jebediah led Finn deeper into the canyon, into a treacherous, maze-like section of jagged rock formations known to the old prospectors as the Wolf's Teeth. It was a place where paths twisted back on themselves, where the wind whistled with an eerie, mournful sound, and where the constant echo could make a man think he was surrounded. Jebediah moved through the labyrinth with the confidence of a man walking through his own home. He knew every blind turn, every loose rock, every vantage point. Once they were deep inside, he stopped. "Make a fire," he commanded Finn. "A small one, but make it smoky." Then, before Finn could ask why, Jebediah melted back into the shadows. He circled around, climbing high above the maze. From his perch, he watched as the smoke from Finn's small fire began to curl up into the night sky. As he expected, it didn't take long for Craven's men to spot it. They left their siege positions and cautiously entered the Wolf's Teeth, assuming their prey was trapped. That was when Jebediah began his game. He dislodged a small rock, sending it clattering down a ravine to their left. The men spun around, rifles raised. A moment later he threw his voice, a perfect imitation of a coyote's yip, from their right. They were already on edge, and the disorienting echoes of the canyon amplified their paranoia. Jebediah became a ghost, a whisper in the darkness. He used his knowledge of the terrain to lead them in circles, to separate them, to turn their own numbers against them. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, and in this maze of stone, Jebediah was the cat. The chase through the Wolf's Teeth lasted for hours, a grueling ordeal that frayed the nerves of Craven's men and exhausted them physically. Jebediah led them on, always just out of sight, until he had herded them exactly where he wanted them, the entrance to Widow's Crossing. It was a natural rock bridge, barely 5 feet wide, that spanned a chasm so deep the bottom was lost in shadow even in broad daylight. It was the only way to cross to the other side of the canyon from here. Jebediah had already sent Finn across with simple instructions. Wait on the other side, and don't move. Now he waited for the sheriff. Craven and Finn emerged from the maze and saw their quarry standing on the far side of the narrow bridge. They raised their rifles, but Jebediah was already there, stepping out from behind a spire of rock onto the near side of the crossing, effectively blocking their path. He held his rifle loosely, not aiming it. He had trapped them. Finn was on one side, Craven was on the other, and Jebediah stood between the sheriff and his vengeance. "This ends here, Craven." Jebediah's voice was calm, but it carried across the chasm. "You want him? You'll have to go through me." For a moment, no one moved. Then Craven, his face a mask of cold fury, took a step onto the bridge. At the same time, Finn, seeing the sheriff's attention focused on Jebediah, saw his chance. He pulled the knife he had kept hidden in his boot and lunged, not at Jebediah, but across the bridge toward Craven. It was a desperate, foolish move. The two men met in the middle of the narrow span. Craven, caught by surprise, stumbled as Finn's knife slashed his arm. They grappled, a frantic, clumsy fight on the precipice. Their combined weight was too much for the ancient, weathered rock. With a great groan and a shower of stone, the section of the bridge where the sub they fought crumbled away. For a split second, they hung in the air, their faces etched with shock. Then, locked in their final, hateful embrace, they plunged into the darkness below. Their screams echoed up the chasm walls, and then were abruptly cut off, swallowed by the profound silence of the deep. Jebediah stood alone on the broken edge of Widow's Crossing, the dust from the rockfall settling around him. The wind moaned through the chasm, a lonely, desolate sound. He looked down into the blackness that had swallowed both the lawman and the killer, but there was nothing to see. The canyon had rendered its judgment. He hadn't fired a shot. He hadn't laid a hand on either of them. He had simply set the stage and allowed their own hatred and desperation to write the final act. But there was no triumph in it, no sense of victory or relief. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness that seemed to rise from the depths of the chasm and settle in his own chest. Slowly, stiffly, he turned and began the long trek back to his cabin. The sun was rising as he arrived, its first rays illuminating a scene of quiet disarray, the abandoned positions of the besiegers, the splintered wood on his porch. It felt like a lifetime ago. He entered the cabin, the place where he had nursed a liar and plotted against a lawman. The air was stale with the smell of fear and sweat. He walked to the water barrel. It was empty. They had been one day away from being forced out by thirst. He had won, but it felt like a bitter, meaningless victory. Later that day, driven by a grim necessity, he undertook the perilous climb down to the bottom of the chasm. It took him hours. He found their bodies amidst the shattered rock. They lay close together, broken and still. The silver map Finn had killed for was clutched in his dead hand, a worthless, blood-stained piece of paper. Jebediah didn't touch it. He left them where they lay for the vultures and the coyotes. It was a brutal end, but the mountains were not a gentle place. As he climbed back out of the chasm, leaving the dead behind, he felt the weight of his solitude more acutely than ever before. He had sought peace in the silence of the mountains, but the echoes of the world had found him, and now the silence was filled with the ghosts of his choices. A year passed. The seasons turned, painting the canyon in the vibrant colors of autumn, then burying it under a thick blanket of winter snow, and finally coaxing it back to life with the tender green of spring. On the surface, Jebediah's life returned to its old rhythms. He checked his traps, hunted for his food, and kept to his isolated cabin. But something inside him had fundamentally changed. The profound, peaceful silence he had once cherished was gone, replaced by a quiet that was heavier, more thoughtful. He no longer saw the canyon as just a refuge from the world of men. He now saw it as a responsibility. He was its keeper, its silent guardian. He had learned a hard lesson. You could not run from the world because you carried a piece of it inside you. His act of compassion, misplaced as it was, had brought violence and death to his sanctuary. But his decision not to become a killer himself, not to surrender to the simple, brutal calculus of revenge, had also changed him. He understood now that the line between good and evil, between justice and vengeance, was as thin and treacherous as the rock bridge at Widow's Crossing. His solitude was no longer an escape, it was a vigil. One cool summer evening, as he sat on his porch watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky, he saw it, a tiny, distant flicker of light far down the canyon. A campfire. New travelers had entered his domain. A year ago he would have retreated into his cabin, barred the door, and waited for them to pass. He would have treated them as an invasion. But now he looked at the distant flame, not with anger or fear, but with a weary sense of purpose. He stood up slowly, his joints creaking. He went inside, not for his rifle, but to put another log on his own fire, making its glow a little brighter, a silent beacon in the vast darkness. He didn't know if these new strangers would bring salvation or more sorrow. He only knew that this time he would not hide. He would face whatever came, not as a hermit running from his past, but as the guardian of Shadow Canyon, ready to meet his fate.